So we'll get started in 1 minute here. I recognize a goodly number of faces. How many of you have taken the early church history class before? Great, great, because I'm going to be building on a few things. If you don't have it, you'll be fine, but I'll be referencing the things which, if you had it, will be more meaningful. So, okay, I think that's 12:45. Yeah. Well, welcome to the middle history of the church. As opposed to the early history where we studied from the time of Jesus, who died in the year 30, and whose the apostles reported seeing risen from the dead, and from then the church movement spreads, and we tracked all that through the first 600 years. We're going to be looking at this bigger chunk of time, my math is terrible, of 900 years, and I didn't call this medieval church history because I think when we think medieval, we usually think just images of high medieval life, you know, the Cathedral of Chartres and the Crusades and stuff, which we will be getting to in detail. But I wanted to call it the middle history because it just has a bit less connotative baggage. So first I want to do a lightning quick recap of the last class, the first 600 years, especially for those of you who didn't get a chance to take it. How did we get to the year 600? So a movement that began with Jesus and his 12 followers developed into a worshiping, teaching, service-oriented community. I gave that idea of it being a polis, like the way we think of a nation state, like a kingdom, called the church. The church spread swiftly throughout the Mediterranean after surviving 280 years of persecution before becoming legal under the emperor who? Constantine, yep. And becoming the state religion in 380 under the emperor Theodosius. Half of the Mediterranean world were Christians by the end of the 4th century. So here's just a picture of the Roman Empire, the world we're talking about. So half of the population here, by the year 400, professed to be Christians. Monasticism begins to flourish under a legalized Christianity as a means of living the Christian life more vigorously when legal faith now fostered laxer faith. The church was troubled by many erroneous teachings and heretics along the way, which we studied in detail. These were put to rest chiefly by all church councils called, what were they called, the name of those councils, do you remember? Ecumenical councils, I think I heard someone say it, and by appeals to tradition and the scriptures. When the Roman Empire fell, a divide set in between the eastern and the western portions of the church as their internal issues differed and communication became more difficult. The Bishop of Rome filled a leadership vacuum that the barbarians left. Ditto, the monasticism that developed into stable communities in a setting of instability. All the while, the East continued to fight over theological subtleties. So that's 6 lectures in 60 seconds. So if you remember where we left off the last series, the very last lecture ended with these 3 things: the rise of monasticism, and this was all in the western portion of the Roman Empire, which was, of course, divided after Theodosius died. The rise of barbarians and the rise of the papacy. And so it's with these themes that we're going to pick up and continue, sort of continuous with the last class. Those of you who took the last class, that's all pretty familiar, right? Is it ringing some bells? Good, good. Welcome. Okay, so yeah, when we talk about that divide, we're talking about in the Roman Empire, Greece, this is the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and then Asia Minor, the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, Carthage. Carthage is part of the West. And then we have the West over here, you know, Spain, France, Italy, what we now call Switzerland, England. So this is the East and the West. And so this divide, for the rest of our time of church history to the present day, this divide stands. And so we need to start thinking in kind of these 2 binary geographical categories. And we're going to have to deal with each in turn, the West and the East, with their separate trajectories. Now, we're going to see a lot of interface, but they're living in different worlds after really this, beginning with the split of Theodosius. You know, remember, Rome was sacked in 410, right? So the different histories commence here. Here's the church in the Middle Ages, you know, the Western Empire, Eastern Empire, different dioceses. Just to give you an idea of the political map of the, you know, we're beginning this class with the year 600. You still have a Roman Empire creating a sort of political unity in the East, right? But in the West, following sort of the fall of the administration of the Roman Empire, the borderlands of the Roman Empire get pushed back, and what you get instead is a group this is even not as detailed as it could be. These are still political divisions, But there are different tribal groups within here, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Vandals in Lombardy and the Saxons. Oh, actually we had the Saxons up here, the Danes, and it's these ethnically gathered tribal groups, some of whom are more warlike, some less. Actually, I believe there's a professor in Ollie who teaches kind of early European medieval, political history. So watch his lectures. Kicklighter, I think his name is. Yeah, watch his lectures for more details there. He knows infinitely more than I do about that stuff. So when I talk about the middle history of the church, this is a breakdown of the church according to kind of the eras which we've broken them down into, generally understood. The early is what we covered. We're looking at this middle period, and then the modern period would be 1500 to the present. So what we see in this 900-year span is the emerging of two churches, East and West. The West tries to figure out what to do with all its power. The East has to iron out minute internal differences and adapt to losing all its power. In general, that's like the big thesis statement for a 900-year span. Obviously, that runs roughshod over a lot of details, but that's a general picture. I love general pictures, so we're going to get even more oversimplifying. I love this. I couldn't find the source for where I heard this. If any of you know, you can tell me on break. When the Latins received Christianity, they turned it into a law. When the Greeks received Christianity, they turned it into a philosophy. When the French received Christianity, they turned it into a culture. And we really see this sort of tripartite division functioning kind of throughout what develops throughout this 900-year period as well. As I wrote this down, I thought, when Americans received Christianity, they turned it into a consumable product. So for this, actually, I want to begin with the year 600 as a sort of semi-arbitrary dividing, but it's really the end of the papal reign of Gregory the Great. And then the 814 is the year that Charlemagne died. So that's kind of the span we're going to look at. Really, in the West, the consolidation of power under Charlemagne and a whole bunch of things. So I'm calling this lecture New and Rising Powers, because we have a new power in the West, which is a consolidating power, and we have a new power in the East, which we're going to come to. Cliffhanger. Okay, well, I guess I'll tell you now. So in the West, there's two great things that I want to look at this afternoon. One is the mission work and its relationship to Britain, intentionally ambiguous because there's both mission in Britain, to Britain, and from Britain, as we're going to see. This is a lecture I particularly delight in, being British, because for a brief glimpse of church history, Britain becomes kind of the epicenter of the Christian world. Anyways, it's kind of exciting. And then the creation of a new Western Christendom under Charlemagne. The first Christendom would be Charlemagne's Christendom, right? And this is a new one under Charlemagne. Sorry, I said Charlemagne. I meant to say Constantine. In the East, they have to face the Islamic conquests and internally continued theological troubles and developments. I got kind of carried away. I don't know how far we'll get into this, but if we don't do it this time, we'll pick up with it next time. Okay. So, mission work in Britain. The establishment of the church in Britain for the 7th century. Let me give a little bit of backstory. So the church existed in the British Isles since the early 2nd century. She had her first martyr in the 3rd century, St. Alban. Great missionary works were accomplished in the 4th and 5th century. This is where we think of St. Patrick. St. Columba in the 6th century and St. David were sort of Celtic missionaries who further strengthened and built up the English church. But throughout the first 500 years of Christianity in Britain, Christianity was always annexed to sort of the authorization of some local lord and his fiefdom. So there was not, replace in your minds what we think of as like Great Britain of today. That's a very late and hard-won unity. It was originally almost a dozen different sort of tribal kingdoms in Wales and Cornwall and Northumbria and Norfolk and Canterbury, all these different Kent, all these different regions. So there's all this kind of this patchwork of kings, and some kings would become Christians and then their sons wouldn't be, and they'd make an ally with another kingdom and they would become Christians and then they would kind of decline. And so there was this kind of upheaval because the fate of the sort of support and authorization of the church was tied to the support of the local leaders. And in a time, outside of sort of Roman governance and infrastructure, it was a very, when we think of, the famous phrase about this period of time, life was nasty, was it dirty, brutish, and short, or something like that, I think Kipling came up with. It was rough times. Like, there weren't sort of structures and institutions to kind of carry the day when individual magnanimous leaders fell off, right? It was carried by the charisma of personality. So it was kind of this up and down in England until, in the 7th century, through a combination of missionary efforts, a stable foundation is finally laid on the British Isles. It was laid spiritually by 7th century monastic missions in Britain. So these are kind of some of the great names of British missionary history from the 7th century. St. Aidan, who founded the famous monastery at Lindisfarne. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. He was supported by the Christian king Oswald, who was sort of, one of these early, not quite as grand as Charlemagne, but kind of, a pious king who really wanted to see Christianity established in his kingdom. St. Kilian, St. Cuthbert, St. Chad. These all have these great hagiographies. If you get a chance to Google sort of the lives of these guys, I mean, awesome stuff. So this is a picture of, I want to say this is St. Chad having died. So we have all these missions, and they're going around, they're gathering communities of monks, they're praying, thinking about touching base with sort of ritual practices we looked at before. They're continuing to read the scriptures, to pray the Psalms, to celebrate the Lord's Supper. And it's this sort of very simple, vibrant, small Christian communities. Just to give you a checklist of a day in the life of a Celtic monk. Step 1, stand chest deep in some freezing cold water and say some prayers. You'll remember that monasticism began as just this sort of zealous, earnest movement of just regular Christians who wanted sort of a more vigorous way, who just went into the desert, right? And they lived, remember we saw some lived on top of poles, and they lived in caves on like the meagerest subsistence. There was this idea, the founder of the religion, Jesus says, take up your cross and deny yourself and follow me. This idea of deny yourself comfort and pleasure and luxury so that you can cultivate the spiritual life and relationship with God that can be found through the not visible to the eyes King, Jesus. You got to deny yourself. So in the desert of Alexandria, that meant go in a cave in the desert. In sort of the wet, cold boglands of Ireland and Wales and Northumbria and Scotland, it meant finding some ice-cold river somewhere and praying your psalms. And they would sometimes pray. The prayer life was very simple. It was chiefly the Psalter, the book of Psalms. You would just pray through the Psalter all day, every day. It takes about 6 hours to pray through the Psalms, and you do it in like 5 chunks. And you would just pray through the Psalms as your prayers to God through the day. You get a tiny bit of food, and you'd work in the scriptorium, transcribing scripture for an hour or two. It's kind of when we talk about monasticism, that's what we're talking about. Which, if you think about it, it's not so very different from, we're 600 years past now, the disciples of Jesus who, right after the resurrection and the ascension, they then gather together and study scriptures and pray and deny themselves so that they can take care of the poor. And of course, in there, everyone's poor, so they're just taking care of each other. But that sort of vibrant spirit, even though a lot of time has passed, some of the initial motivating structures of the community are still recognizable. I just want to point out Lindisfarne. This is Northumbria in England. And it's this tiny little island. This is not the whole of it. This is kind of like a little peninsula of it. But it's very small. But when the tide goes out, you can actually walk across sort of where the ocean, the North Sea is, and get to Lindisfarne. Any of you ever been to Lindisfarne? Okay. Well, if you're ever in England, it's one of my desires to go see. So this is where this sort of forsaken bit of island, Aidan sets up the great monastery of Lindisfarne, which is one of the epicenters of Celtic Christianity. Sorry, I forgot to turn my phone off. There you go. So this is kind of where we're talking. This is the wasteland for Britain. It's the desert. And on the continent, so think France and Germany, there's much political and religious turmoil, warring Gothic kings, and no strong pope following Gregory for some time. So Christian monks and scholars actually flee to Britain under sort of a temporary respite under Oswald and some of this flourishing of Christian monastic mission. And they bring manuscripts with them. There's sort of this, seems to be this sort of exodus of some of the intellectuals of the day into England from the continent to get away from both decadence and war on the continent. So this is called the Lindisfarne Gospel. This is the opening page of the Gospel of Luke. If you know Latin, you can read quoniam quide multicona insunt ordinar narrationem. For as many as have set down to narrate the story of Jesus Christ. And they would decorate with these wonderful, mysterious, they still puzzle scholars. Just technically, how did they do this? They actually didn't figure out even sort of the basic geometry of it until like the 1950s in terms of some of these proportions. And so this was produced on the island of Lindisfarne under Aidan. So it's in the scriptorium. The other pages of writing were not quite this elaborate. Just the opening pages had these big detailed things. But we see here a treasuring of the scriptures, but also an incorporation of sort of Celtic decorative art and symbolism into the Christianity there. I have a 3-foot by 4-foot picture of this in my room in my house. And every time, it stops me in my tracks every time, and I find some new detail. It's like, oh, it's just amazing. If you want to see a great movie that captures the spirit of 7th century England and Ireland, watch a movie called The Secret of Kells. It's an animation made by the Board of Ireland, the Film Board of Ireland. It's a great film, and it captures the feeling of the time and gives kind of a psychological rationale for why they would draw all these tiny spirals. It's a great film. Yeah?
So there's any secret messages or anything in the actual details of the drawings around it?
Good question. So no, it doesn't appear that there's any secret messages. There is a sort of traditioned Christian numerology, so lots of 3s and 1s because of Trinity, like 3 persons of God and 3 in one nature. So you have, kind of 3 inside a single triangle, and you'll see 12s for the disciples, 4 for the evangelists. So there is basic Christian numerology. The rest seems to be decorative, actually bordering on doodling. I've studied these quite a bit, and look at this. This is a cat down here. And we know that the monks kept cats. And on the back page of this gospel, one just like this, there's a note where the guy wrote a poem about his cat that kept him company in the cold while he was a scribe. And so some of them are very bizarre. Some of them are based on, there's these, I think it's called, later on they turned into bestiaries, they were called, these kind of, they're the first biology manuals of all the different animals. And so there was sort of a love of God's nature. So they tried to incorporate as many animals as they knew. But for my study of them, it's not much more than just doodling in most cases. Yeah?
What size is that?
Good question. I think it's about like this. So like maybe 2 foot by 18 inches, I think. Yeah. Good question. So we get unique historical insights from the church in medieval Britain. What we see is a form of Christianity that's taken root in new soil. Right? Prior to this, everything we've studied up till now in the last class was still happening in a Greco-Latin, Roman-conquered, kind of Mediterranean-influenced world. Even if you're in France or the Levant, it's Rome. Here, for the first time, we see Christianity planting in soil that is not Rome. I mean, technically, under Hadrian, it was at once, there was some Roman, oversight, but it wasn't Mediterranean culture. And so what's so fascinating about Celtic Christianity is it's one of the early instances, and there are others in other directions. You can think of Armenian and Georgian Christian culture on the other side of the Roman Empire. But what you see is, well, what sticks? What parts of Christianity at the time were seen as manifestly as sort of cultural trappings, and what was the core? And so even though they're Celtic Christians, they're still doing some similar stuff, but they're also doing some different stuff from Christians in the Mediterranean. And what we see is Christianity emerging kind of out of the ashes of the Roman Empire. Unlike in the British Isles, Christianity didn't fall when the Roman Empire fell. It had this sort of vitality that it could transplant into a totally different culture, totally different leadership structure, take root, and it would be recognizable. St. Paul could have, if you could have time walked to Lindisfarne, would have recognized his brothers. And yet it also was different. So what was continuous, the ministry maintained, and ministry succeeded from the apostles. There were still these sort of lineages of ordination. They saw the monastic life as the highest ideal. They revered and studied the scriptures. They had to teach pagans the faith. They were often persecuted for their Christian worship by rival kings. And they were very mission-focused, just like the apostles who went out preaching on these preaching missions, right? The Celts went out on these preaching missions. And they were earnest to propagate the Christian teaching and enlarge the reach of the church. So all of that is recognizable to Mediterranean Christianity of the first 6 centuries. Just to give you some more visuals, this is one of the oldest cathedrals in the world in terms of the actual building. Like there's been a cathedral in Rome for longer than this, but the St. Peter's Basilica right now was built in the 16th century. This is the actual building from the 650s, still standing. It's called I love these English names. It's called St. Peter's on the Cliff at Bradwell-on-Sea. Couldn't get a more English name than that. But look at the simple building. You've got the altar up front, and that's not the original altar, I don't presume. But this sort of simple structure. You can picture these Celtic Christians gathering and praising and celebrating communion. It was also distinctive. The desert, and I've touched on this. They didn't have a desert, they went to barren rocks. This is Skellig Michael off the west coast of Ireland, where, believe it or not, 3 hermits would live at any one time on sort of opposite cracks of the island, and they would eat moss and seagull and lichen and mussels just to survive. They would collect rainwater for fresh water, and they would just stay there saying their prayers for decades. I mean, the Celts were tough dudes. They preferred a hermit-style monasticism, like the desert, to a community style. They used the older translation of the Latin scriptures, which shows how early Christianity got to England. You'll remember from last class, Jerome made the definitive Latin translation in the late 300s, the Vulgate, that's still the authoritative tradition today. Before his definitive tradition, there was a number of sort of earlier ones which were had made it to Ireland and continued to be the scriptures that are in use there. And their self-discipline was very severe. Their mission strategy, they would make these boats out of animal skin. This is called a coracle. And they would get in it and they would say, God, take me to the people that you want me to preach your gospel. And then they would just put out into the North Sea and just land where they did and then start preaching. It's like, wow! Now, sometimes that would be further down the coast at some neighboring kingdom, and then they would discover it was the same land. Or sometimes it would be across to Scandinavia. Sometimes there's even sort of legends of getting to Iceland. I mean, it's like, you got to have a lot of courage to put yourself in the Atlantic. But it reveals they're a very zealous bunch. Distinct from Mediterranean, it's this distinct flavor. I want to point out a couple of details of the distinction, because what we're going to see in this lecture is actually the sowing of the seeds of all of the things that would come to full bloom in the 200 years before Martin Luther, which would then prompt the Reformation. So catch this. It was the Irish who developed private confession for a Christian to a priest. In the earliest days of the church, if you were in Constantinople in the 4th century, the only confession was public, and it was only for grievous sins that everybody already knew about. So let's say you were caught in an adulterous relationship, and you wanted to come to communion the next Sunday. You had to actually stand up in front of the congregation and say, I've sinned with adultery. And then the bishop would say, okay, your penance is you need to wait outside with the non-Christians who desire to be converts for 2 years, weeping if possible, and then if you prove your earnestness on Easter Sunday, we'll let you back into communion. And so, now this didn't happen all that often because it was only for the most egregious kind of court offenses. But that system of kind of confessing and penance and reconciliation, it gets expanded by the Irish to be for small sins, where you would actually then confess, well, in private, not in public, to the priest, well, actually, I was really gluttonous at lunch today. And that was like, well, that is a sin, and bless you for confessing it. And so this system of private confession, and as well as with it, a penitential system where there was some almost sort of like a objective kind of law, in a way, created that these faults require these penances, and there was some sort of moral thought, well, how much does that particular sin in those conditions damage the soul? Well, not very much. Okay, just say an extra few psalms today. Oh, a lot? Oh, well, now you're on bread and water for the next 5 years. People sometimes talk today about Celtic Christianity like it was just this kind of hippie, earth-loving Christianity. They loved the earth, but it was the opposite of hippie. It's the most severe penitential system in Christian history. If you mispronounced a psalm, you were on bread and water for a week. I mean, it was rigorous. But they developed private confession and a penitential system. Those of you who have a glimpse of kind of the later Middle Ages, do you see the seed there, right? For what comes. They followed ritual customs as they learned them. Here's what's so interesting. The way the Irish calculated Easter was according to a controversy which died in the East hundreds of years prior. It was called the Quartodeciman controversy. It was settled at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Do you celebrate Easter on the day of Passover reckoned by the Jewish reckoning, or on the Sunday right after that? That was the big question. And the church very early on settled you always do it on a Sunday. But the Christians in Ireland, sort of on this island away from the main empire, doing their Celtic thing, they never got the memo about the Sunday, so they just kept doing it on Passover. They're like, oh, first full moon after the spring equinox, Easter. They had a few other customs. I'm mentioning all this because it's going to come to bear in just a moment. On the whole, Celtic Christianity stemming out from the north, right? Scotland, Iona was founded by Columbus. No, not Columbus. What's his name? Columba, thank you. reached Ireland, Wales, and northern and central England. So think of Celtic Christianity, think of England kind of from the north and from the west, kind of moving down. That's sort of the Celtic influence. Before I go on to sort of the other influence, which is going to be coming up from the continent, kind of approaching England from the south, any questions or thoughts on Celtic Christianity? Yeah?
You mentioned they eat a little bit of food after they freeze themselves in water.
Right.
What kind of food do they eat?
Yeah. I mean, it was simple kind of subsistence agrarianism. I mean, so there would have been very, like meat, fish. They did have, bread and stuff that, fruits and veg that you could, there was cultivated vegetable, fruit. I mean, it was pretty simple fare. I mean, there was no trade really to speak of. Yeah, so it was very simple.
Themselves?
It's what?
Cook it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, cooking themselves, a lot of the food would be eaten, could be, stuff that you could eat raw, like vegetables and found fruits. Yeah. They had cats. Yeah, that's true. I don't know if they ate the cats. I don't think they did. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, when Columba left Ireland in a coracle,
Yeah.
he had his 12 with him, and they said that he just was going to sail to where he could not see Ireland again anymore because he was afraid it would draw him back home.
Huh.
So he went first, I don't know if it was one of the Treshnish or whatever, but ended up on Iona because that was the first place he couldn't look back and see Ireland.
Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, very.
And their magazine from the community is called The Coracle.
Okay, yeah. There's still a community of Christians on Iona. I had a friend who visited recently. He brought me back a rock from the ground, and I like to think that Columba might have kicked it or something, that some connection to it. But yeah. So yeah, cool. So from the other side then, coming up from the south, so think of this kind of Celtic flavor Christianity coming down from the north and from the west. From the south, we get these missions from Rome coming up into the south of Britain. So we mentioned last time very briefly Augustine of Canterbury. He dies right at the beginning of the era we're looking at, 604, same year Gregory the Great dies. In 597, he established the monastery and see of Canterbury, same year St. Columba died. King Ethelbert of Kent had recently kind of received this Celtic mission. He was favorable to Christianity. And so Augustine founds a monastery and cathedral in Canterbury, and he founds a Benedictine monastery, because Gregory the Great loved St. Benedict, who was just a few decades prior to himself, and did a lot to encourage Benedictine monasticism, sort of in the realm that was under his authority. And so when he sends Augustine up, he sends Benedictine monks to England. All those who succeeded Augustine of Canterbury came up from the continent. All of Augustine's immediate successors were people of kind of Italian origin and blood who came up to England. So you have this sort of clash of cultures. So that's St. Lawrence, Honorius, Paulinus, the great founder of York. These were all Benedictines, Latins, kind of from Italy. So Roman Christians did things a little differently. Their monasticism was Benedictine. Cenobitic is the fancy word for community-based, not Celtic, which was Eremitic, which just means desert, like by yourself. And they calculated the date of Easter differently. Christians in Rome always did it on a Sunday. So all of a sudden, these two things start to clash, especially when it's Easter time. When are we going to celebrate Easter? Who gets to say? We can't do two different Easters. So what happens, and kind of condensing this, is there's the Synod of Whitby in the year 664 under the aegis of King Oswy. Everyone's got great names back then. The question was, well, which custom should we follow on these British Isles, Roman or Celtic? And after some kind of push and shove, what won the day was Roman. It was like, well, it's actually the establishment of the See of Canterbury and sort of this papal support. This actually needs to be our norm from now on. And a number of Celtic Christians agreed. Actually, one guy in particular, St. Wilfrid, he's kind of the middleman who's Celtic by blood, trained in Celtic monasticism. He's a disciple of Aidan on Lindisfarne. But he hears sort of from all these archbishops of Canterbury and about the Roman practices around the rest of the Mediterranean, and he says, yeah, we got to be on board with the rest of the church. We got to change. And so he was able to kind of effect the changing over. There was a few people who were not happy, like St. Colman. But ultimately, these things get merged, and the Roman trumps the Celtic. So there's always this sort of undertone flavor, but it's never more than an undertone after the Synod of Whitby. So what happens then is all of the monasteries, who previously had just been, well, it would be almost inappropriate to say monastery proper. They're just a gaggle of hermits was really what Celtic Christianity was. they took the Benedictine rule and said, okay, well, we're going to follow this rule for our common life. And okay, well, let's all pray together and let's build it, let's kind of do things in a more Benedictine way. So we see Benedictinism, all of a sudden, the sort of spiritual foundation of Celtic monasticism gets this new layer of Benedictine monasticism, and that, again, is laying a huge building block for the rest of medieval history. Just sort of as part of this sort of Roman, sort of the sort of Latin, Mediterranean Roman wave kind of crashing over the culture of Celtic Christianity, there's this very interesting figure named Theodore of Tarsus. He's an Archbishop of Canterbury starting in 669. And he is the person who first divvies up the whole country of England into dioceses that still exist today. Like the diocesan borders, they're the ones that Theodore of Tarsus set up. And what's so interesting is he's a Greek. He's not just a Latin, he's actually Greek. And he comes through Italy, gets sent up, and he takes his post at age 66. It's one thing I love about the church, actually. The seminary I trained at, Nashotah House, the dean who became dean when I was there, took his post at age 77. I'm like, yeah, like in a culture of like disposability and sort of phasing out and retirement and all, it was like to see someone's like, no, we want that guy because he's old and wise. It was so refreshing to see like, yes, and we loved him, Dean Salmon. He was like a papa to all of us. So anyways, I just love that tradition in the church. And he serves for 20 years till he's 86. And he really sort of takes the idea of Whitby and actually implements it through administration throughout the land of Britain. So he's really sort of the administrative catalyst for establishing a Latin-structured, Benedictine, solid Christianity across the British Isles. It's Theodore of Tarsus. So this stability that's created by this sort of coming together, the sort of final Christianization of most of the peoples in the British Islands, stability is a precondition for scholarship and creativity, right? For the most part. It really encourages it. So we get more literary production. This is the famous Book of Kells. It's kind of the famous older cousin of Lindisfarne. Here's sort of the text of the Book of Kells written in the Old Latin. And you can see sort of they're doodling between the letters, like let's just put a bird in here and let's just make that S really long to like make it look pretty. These elaborate designs. And I feel like in the faces of the portraiture of Celtic art, you see something of this sort of bright-eyed, like burning Celtic, vivid Christianity. I mean, look at that face. This is a picture of Jesus sitting on a throne with I'm not sure what the book is supposed to be. It could be the Book of Deeds, the Book of Judgment, or the Bible. It's in iconography, it can be either one. But that sort of face is just so vibrant. I think it's quite captivating. What's really interesting is some art scholars say that there's some designs in here that are only found anywhere else in the world in Ethiopia, which means a lot of scholars thought that there was somehow some monks from Egypt and Ethiopia that somehow made it to Ireland in some of the early years, which is fascinating, stuff lost to history. There's a flourishing of learning. Theodore of Tarsus founds a school, right? There hadn't been schools in Western Europe since hundreds of years before Rome could support them. So now it's not the empire and sort of established Greco-Roman institutions creating schools for the aristocracy. It's churches creating schools for anybody, right? There's a big difference there. But schools get created, and they're connected to monasteries, which are connected to cathedrals. The word minster is just an old contraction of the word monastery. So Westminster was once a monastery-cathedral combo. So you get other guys, Benedict Biscop, Ceolfred, these guys found these scriptorium monastery schools, which really encourages all this learning. It's out of this learning we get the monk, the Bede, always known as the Venerable Bede. He's always called that. There's a great legend about how someone was writing the epitaph for his tombstone, and they couldn't figure out what word to describe him with. And they came back the next morning and they said an angel carved in the word venerabilis. And he's been called the Venerable Bede ever since. He gives us the history of the English church, a book you can buy on Amazon for $1 in translation from the Latin. Here's an early manuscript where he gives us, it's a primary source for much of the material I just presented of English church history. And there's a scholarly tradition born. Bede trained scholars who set up these great schools and great libraries, chiefly in Canterbury and York, the two great sees of England. And I want to just mention one name. In this sort of academic lineage is a man named Alcuin. Just want you to remember that name because we're going to come back to it. I don't have time to read all these. I'm going to share the slides with you. I have did most of you get an email from me like a week and a half ago about the class? Did anybody not get an email? If you didn't get an email, if after class you could see Judy, can you wave your hand? If you give your email to Judy after class, I'll add you to my email list. Because I'll send out the slides after each class if you want to look at the pictures or read the stuff I skip over. So these are some glimpses of the piety of the times. That part of it was already something in the 7th century that when a holy person died, you would say communion, you would celebrate communion in memory of their death. Again, think about the later Middle Ages, the masses for the dead that we're going to see. That practice is already found there in 7th century Christianity. So these are quotes from Bede's Ecclesiastical History. We see a love of relics. I think 5 times in Bede's Ecclesiastical History, a holy man dies, and people who sort of honored him, they go back to the spot on which he died, and they take scrapings of the dust and the dirt from where he had fallen, and they put it in water and drink it, and they're cured of their diseases. And, you know, how to account for this, it's possible that they actually were cured. And whether it was sort of natural remission or something medicinal to do it, or a miracle of God, that's up to sort of skepticism and science to try and sift out together. But it is the case that what they thought healed was the piety, the Holy Spirit filledness of this saint sort of oozed out of them. I don't know if you ever get a chance to study Charles Taylor and his understanding of how our concept of the self has developed in the modern era. He uses the language that prior to the modern era, and by that I mean kind of 1500 and beyond, the self was seen as a kind of porous thing, that like the inspirations of the cosmos could sort of affect you. I mean, it's this where astrology comes from, right? That, like, you're sort of malleable to the things that nature is throwing at you, but also you can ooze out into nature sanctity, that the dust of your body could become something that would be medicinal. So very interesting glimpse into the church history of the time. Holy militarism against pagans. This is the full story. I'll just summarize it. So there was still these sort of people groups who were not on board with the sort of more sort of Christianity of England, the Saxons and the Picts, and they'd war against some of these local kings who were devoted Christians. And at one point, this is a great thing because it gives a whole picture of Holy Week, which we've looked at in previous lectures, and celebrating Easter and Lent, a 40-day Lent. And it says they're being attacked, and after they're done with their Easter communion, they wanted to make sure they're fully done with Easter. They go out, and what they do is they camp out against the Picts, and they kind of hide in this valley. And then they turn to the bishop, and they realize they're outnumbered. They're like, "Bishop, what should we do?" And the bishop says, "Just start yelling hallelujah." And so all of these sort of like Christians, you know, peasant soldiers start going, "Hallelujah, hallelujah." And it says it made such an echo that the Saxons and the Picts just ran off. And it was called the Alleluia victory to this day. So anyways, this story is recounted by Bede. Yeah, and it's really interesting to see, so one of the greatest medieval historians, he wrote the book I recommended, which is called The Western Society and the Church of the Middle Ages, as part of the Penguin series on the history of the church. Jarrow, which is where Bede was from in the center of England, had become the chief center of Roman civilization in Europe. That the monasteries, through the church, had become this sort of vehicle for classical life, because at these schools they didn't just study the Bible, they also studied the classics and transcribed these writings. And the library that was in York was considered the best stocked library in the whole Western world at the time, because there was this, remember that flood of scholars out of the continent, as well as all these things. Christianity was in England the means of introducing barbarian peoples to the civilizing effects of learning. Another great medieval church scholar. Now what I want to say is that civilization was not the goal of the monks. Their goal was that they'd spread this news about Jesus with this sort of simplicity. It was sort of this collateral, what's the opposite of damage? Collateral building up was the fact that, well, if you want to read the Bible, you've got to learn to read. You know, well, if you want to sing psalms, you've got to learn to sing. Well, if you want, you know, and there was this thing of this sort of educational component came along with it. And so there was sort of this dual, this sort of synthesized thing happening in England of civilization taking root for the first time since Hadrian, 500 years before, and the gospel also coming into the land. So it's very, very interesting times. The ecclesial strength and intellectual resources cultivated in England then spill back over into the continent. So it's like the cup of England, the British Isles keeps kind of filling up with all these things, and it then spills back over to the continent, which is in need of all these things, learning and the gospel. So we get missions now from Britain, right? So we've had Celtic missions, kind of in-house to the British Isles, Latin missions, and then from all this learning and mission, it overflows back to what we now call Denmark, no, not Denmark, Holland and Belgium and the northern part of Germany. There's really two guys, names worth remembering, there are probably others, but Willebrord, I've actually seen this statue in the flesh, which I was in Utrecht, which is really, it was cool to see. He was a missionary to Holland, and what's really interesting is he seeks protection from the local king, and the king said, well, if you really want authority here, you need to go see the Pope. Again, it's like these sort of ominous foreshadows of stuff that's going to come in our later lectures. You got to get the Pope's permission first. And note that the king of the Franks, Pepin, who we're going to come to in a minute, and the Pope were working together. And Willebrord also founds Benedictine monasteries, some of which survive to this day. Boniface is the other great name. He's called the Apostle to the Germans. He also sought papal authority for his mission, also founds monasteries. At the end of his life, he establishes the Episcopal See at Mainz. This is a picture of him. When people sometimes talk about like the role of religion with colonialism, and it's a very important question to investigate with great sensitivity. But one of the things that is, I think, the biggest picture allows us to keep in view is if you have Anglo-Saxon blood, your forefathers weren't Christians. They were tree worshippers. Right? My forefathers, my ancestors, worshipped trees. It was actually sort of a gift that I no longer worship trees, in my estimation, and get to worship the one true God who made the universe. So there was this sort of fierce clash of pagan religions and Christianity, especially among the Saxons. And so the Saxons had a handful of these trees that were sort of especially sacred sites, and one of them was called Thor's tree, and Boniface says, I'm not having it. I'm chopping that thing down. They said, don't, Thor's going to cut you down. He'll strike you with lightning. He's the god of thunder. He'll kill you. And Boniface is like, watch me. Takes his axe, chops this tree down, chops up the lumber, builds a chapel, celebrates communion to the Lord Jesus Christ in it. And everyone's watching. They're like, Thor's going to get him. Thor's going to get him. And then like after a few days, it's like, oh, did Thor not get me? And they're like, okay, I guess we'll worship your God. So I told this to my bishop one time. I said, I just love that story of Boniface and chopping down Thor's tree. I'm like, what is the equivalent in our day? And he's this older man. He's probably, he's about 70. And he says, well, you know, I don't want to see you walking to people's homes with a little hammer and smashing their televisions. Well, that was a good... as a good bishop telling me that he didn't want to see me do that, but clearly giving me some instruction. I want to take a pause there because I realize I've been speaking kind of rapidly with my excitement for this new class. Any questions or thoughts about sort of what we've seen kind of around the British Isles for this 150-year period? Yeah.
Could you give us a quick background on the Benedictines and what they believe and set them apart?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, the sort of trajectory of monasticism is it begins with random hermits who then start to kind of gather in clumps with disciples, and they start to get regulated by different rules to like govern their life, so it's not just at the caprice of either master or student. And so various sort of great teachers of the church give some shaping to communal monastic life. St. Basil in the 4th century, St. Augustine in the early 5th century write these rules of this is how monks should live. You should wake up at these times, you should read this amount of scripture per day, you should do this much service activity per day, you should always obey the abbot. When the abbot dies, here's how you elect him, that kind of thing. But they were kind of rough and they weren't full pictures. Benedict was the first person to write it's called the Rule of St. Benedict, which is simply sort of, it's just a canons and constitution for monastic life. Now it's full of spiritual insights because he's a really spiritual guy, but it's basically, I mean, half of it is on like how to organize sort of the various functional roles within the monastery. Like, okay, you each take turns being the doorkeeper, the cook, the dishwasher, the garden, you know. And then, but he also sort of synthesized something which really took root, pun intended, for Europe, which is that monks shouldn't just be people of prayer, they should also be hard workers, that you should work with your hands. Ora et labora is the famous Benedictine phrase, which is Latin for prayer and work. So it was this sort of earthy, self-sufficient to a community, because it's, again, he's writing after the wake of the fall of Rome. In a way, Augustine and Basil before him were not. So it's this way of creating a community where if you have 8 guys, you can basically be a mini village unto yourselves, living in orderly spiritual community under an abbot that you elect. He actually came up with this sort of electoral system, unique. We have no known predecessor to it before him, which actually some scholars trace as sort of the sort of ideological germ for the electoral system generally. This idea of like, well, from among us, let us elect our most senior leader who will rule, and then it hems him in actually with some checks. The leader cannot do these things. So actually, the rule provides some stability. So it was just sort of the most, after sort of hundreds of years of trial and error, it was the most synthesized way of, and the most level-headed way of organizing Christian community. It's not, if you want to read it, the Rule of Benedict in print, it's only 40 pages. I mean, so you could, small pages, you can read it pretty easy. If you're reading it and you get bogged down, flip ahead to chapter 73, which is called A Toolbox for Virtue, where he just lists all, like 50 things where it's like, if you're sort of languishing in your heart, like start doing these things and surely your zeal will pick up, and it's a wonderful list. Okay, what time do we go till, Judy? I've forgotten. 10 after 2. Okay, so this would be a good time to take an 8 to 10 minute break. We'll regather and we'll pick up with Charlemagne and Christendom when we come back. All right. Any questions or reflections while you were catching a breather there? Well, then we'll just dive right back in. I want to talk about the creation of a new Christendom by Charlemagne. So, the one piece of political history to know to understand what happens with Charlemagne is that in sort of feudal Frankish Europe of this time, there were these lines of Gothic kings, but the king had very little power, kind of like the Queen in England today. It's a very symbolic role. The sort of CEO of the kingdom was called the mayordomo, or the mayor. And so that was where the real political intrigue lay, was in the sort of succession of mayordomos, of mayors. And throughout sort of the centuries before, there was sort of like differing divisions of what Franconia looks like, and roughly corresponding with the with most of modern day France, but still somewhat different. But beginning in the year 718, so we're kind of marching on kind of linearly through time here from what we just looked at. There was civil unrest over the mayoral leadership, and this guy steps in and sort of vanquishes some of the skirmishes and kind of rises to authority, and the mayordomo becomes Charles Martel. And if you've heard the name Carolingian Empire, most people think that's named because of Charlemagne. It's actually not. It's from Charles Martel. Carol is the Latin word for Charles. So Charles is a great leader, and he expands the size of the kingdom in both directions. He's sort of like this very kind of military, strong administrator, and is a Christian. We don't know that much about sort of the shape of his Christian life, but he is a Christian. And the area, what we would now think of just sort of the southwest edge of France, what's called Aquitaine, I think to this day, Aquitania, is not, at this point, part of the Frankish kingdom. But they get threatened from their southern neighbors, which is the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate. I say, well, where did Muslims come from? Well, that's the next part of the lecture. We're going to come to that in just a second. But there's this, in the city of Tours, which is in modern-day France, there's a battle between sort of the forces of Aquitaine, and Charles Martel comes in to help. And he says, look, I'll help you as long as you become a part of my kingdom once this is over. And the Duke of Aquitaine says, sure thing. And in the Battle of Tours, the largest empire in the world at the time, as we're about to see a bit later, I never know how to pronounce this word, Umayyad? Does anyone know how to pronounce that word? Umayyad, right? Okay. Umayyad Caliphate, actually meets sort of at its very northwesterly edge this Frankish kingdom at its very southwesterly edge in the Battle of Tours in 732. The Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers, must ever remain one of the great events in the history of the world, as upon its issue depended whether Christian civilization should continue in Europe or Islam prevail throughout Europe. Sorry, or prevail throughout Europe. It's a fascinating. A number of historians have said, like, this is probably the single most decisive battle in world history in terms of when we look at the shape of things, because if Charles Martel had have lost, it would have been an immeasurable resource gain for that edge of the Umayyad Caliphate, who would have then unquestionably, like, Europe was a scattered array of feudal lords, and the Umayyad Caliphate was an administrative military machine. I mean, they had it going on as an empire. They would have annihilated Europe, I mean, in terms of its power and prowess. And then unquestionably, Europe would have become as part of an Islamic state, and the history would be very different, both for Europe and thus the world, and then also for the trajectory of the church, the life it would have had. This is not a contemporary portrait. So that happens, and I want to just flag that because it shows this sort of clash between Islamic military forces and Christian military forces. After Charles Martel comes Pepin, who he wanted to get rid of the symbolic king. So he's the mayordomo, and to do that, he goes to the Pope. And again, this is one of those sort of telltale, whispery things. He says, Pope, is it right that a person who claims all the power has no power? Is that right? And the Pope says, which Pope was it? Pope Zachary says, it is good to call the one who has the power king. So being very diplomatic, but still it legitimizes Pepin's kingship. He actually takes a kingship for himself after being first just mayordomo. So what we get then is a king, sort of replacing the Gothic line of kings with this new bloodline of Charlemagne, because Pepin had two sons, and one died, and that left Charlemagne as this king of this expanded Frankish kingdom. Side note, Pepin, Charlemagne's father, sometimes spelled Pippin, but usually Pepin, he has an Irish monk as his advisor. Right? So here we see that mission we saw overspilling from the British Isles, Virgilius of Salzburg, who advised him to seek anointing from as king. And who does he get to anoint him but Boniface of Mainz, that missionary who we just looked at, anointed him in 751. Now he wanted kind of an extra anointing, so Pope Stephen came up and anointed him in 754 and called him Patrician of the Romans, right? Again, think of that east-west divide. Like, there already is someone who is nominally the defender of the Roman Empire, and it's the emperor in Constantinople, who is no help at all in this sort of very divided east-west world. And so Stephen, recognizing that he's not getting any help from the east, is like, you, Pepin, are our true patrician. And he crowns him. The first time a pope ever crowned a civil leader. Think about that. I mean, now we kind of think of like a big authoritative papacy, but the Pope's just some bishop of Rome who's got some power by accident because the Goths left a big power vacuum. Now he's crowning a king and giving him spiritualized legitimacy, right? Okay, isn't it just sort of creepy, like seeing how much this stuff will balloon in the later Middle Ages? But Stephen, he's sort of just the de facto mayordomo of Rome, and he's just doing what's good for his people. He's like, well, still a lot of wars going on. Be nice to have a strong military leader on our side. You bet I'll give you this crown. But that he would think that he had the authority to do so from sort of the authority that the papacy had sort of gathered to itself in the previous 2 centuries. So Charlemagne comes from Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great. This is his lifespan. Here's a coin, which is actually from his era, and a later portrait. Charlemagne creates a Christian empire. He is a devout Christian, unlike Constantine, who there's real sort of historical speculation. Like, was he just kind of using the name of Christianity to kind of accomplish his ends? Maybe. Charlemagne is not that way. He's the real deal. He seems to be as zealous and pious as a monk. His son gets called Louis the Pious because he spent so much time instructing him in the ways of Christianity and of a devoted life. He also sort of independently and concomitantly possessed great leadership abilities and ambition. So together he synthesizes this vision. He has this idea, like with his sort of political thing, he wants to sort of expand the Frankish Empire. And with a genuinely earnest deal, it's like, I want to see these people stop worshipping trees and cutting their wrists to make it rain. I want to see them worshiping Jesus. Like he has this sort of Christian vision, this colonial empire vision of a kingdom for Christ that he wants to help established. And what we're going to see from here on out is every ideology is militarized. right? It's just sort of the way you think in this Middle Ages. It's like, here's a good idea, give it a sword. So we'll see that on all sides. We're going to see that throughout, in just a bit, the Islamic Caliphate. We're going to see it with the Crusades. Things which, by today's lights, on all sides, are like, how did they do that? But it was what you did. But I do want to say that so the enlargement of the kingdom brings the gospel of Jesus into pagan lands. So just a mind-blowing aside, I didn't realize till prepping for this lecture, every monarch in Western Europe today has a bloodline back to Charlemagne. They're still living in the continuous hereditary bloodlines from Charlemagne. Did you guys know that? I did not know that. So these are just some, these are teeny tiny, but you could zoom in on them when I send you the slides. But you can actually trace Charlemagne to William the Conqueror, and then from William the Conqueror, the lines are very clear. So this is all the royal family of today. I mean, like Queen Elizabeth II on the throne in England right now, her blood goes back to Charlemagne's blood. So I just did not realize that we're still living in the dynastic age that Charlemagne founded. So yeah, very, very interesting. Charlemagne, here, the greatest tree of the sort of tree-worshipping Saxons was called the Irminsul, and Charlemagne had it torn down. Tear down these trees was sort of the mission. Charlemagne comes to the Pope's aid. Pope Adrian asks him to help fight the Lombards, who are in northern Italy, which Charlemagne does. He's got this great resources, great power, good military strategy, and he becomes king of Lombardy. This is the crown of Lombardy. You can go see this in a museum somewhere in Europe. It was actually put on Charlemagne's head. You want to hear the crazier thing? This exact one. You see this band of dark metal in here? The claim is that that's one of the nails from Christ's cross. Now, it's improbable that it's one of the nails of Christ's cross. It's not impossible, but it's improbable. But it's interesting that that was what they thought. I mean, to see the sort of, don't look at it for the object in terms of its skeptical, like what we can say about it objectively as an object, but in the symbolic ideas of the people that used it, that placed it on the head and wore it on the head. This idea of the crown, the nail of Christ and an earthly kingdom synthesized into a single crown. Right? That really captures the idea of Charlemagne. Whether or not it's a real nail, the idea, what they thought it was, is clearly communicating some sort of Christian sanctioning of this military authority, but also this idea that Christianity should inform the kind of kingdom that you oversee and administrate. Charlemagne reaffirms the papal states that Pepin gave the Pope. Again, Vatican City State, still a political entity today, right? That was granted by Pepin, Charlemagne's father, reaffirmed by Charlemagne. So we see sort of Pope and King of the Franks helping each other. So Charlemagne conquers Saxons, he kind of expands his empire, creates this stability, and he wants to see sort of these pagan peoples become Christians, and he realizes you can't just tear down their tree, right? You have to do more than that. You have to tell them what it means to be a Christian, but for that, you've got to learn how to speak the same language, you've got to translate books, you've got to learn the languages, you've got to establish learning. And what's flooding into the continent right now from the British Isles, but learning from these great resources. So this is called the Carolingian Renaissance. It was Charlemagne's very intentional creation of educational and religious instructional institutions for his kingdom, for the advancing of the gospel. That was his chief reason in view. It's called the Renaissance to this day. And who does he invite down to be his sort of chief architect of this educational religious program? Alcuin. Right, one of the students of that intellectual tradition out of England. He comes from York, and he's a Benedictine. He becomes the master of the palace school at Aachen, which is Charlemagne's primary residence. And so the flourishing of Christian education in Britain returns to fund the Renaissance on the continent. Again, it's not just the Bible and church history. They do math and natural sciences, basic physics and geology and astronomy, music, and art. It's Alcuin who invents the idea of the trivium, right? Like the idea of grammar, logic, and rhetoric being the foundation of an education. That's Alcuin who came up with that. So dispel forever this idea of the Dark Ages, right? To just come up with this whole cloth in very meager material resources in a way, like is very impressive. So that's why it's called the Carolingian Renaissance. It produces monasteries with scriptoria. This is a monastery built around the time of the Carolingian Renaissance. This is in Conques, France. So you can kind of see the architecture. This is sort of very, very early Gothic. We can come back to that. They're Benedictine monasteries. So Benedictinism, which came out of northern Italy, where Benedict was, and sort of gets transplanted through Gregory the Great's missionaries to England, now comes back in to the continent, and all these Benedictine monastic houses get founded. Abbots, because these were simultaneously monasteries, cathedrals, schools, they were component pieces of Charlemagne's educational reform plan. The abbots were sort of key players of state, which means they acquired wealth and some power. And we're going to see where that goes. So they produced monasteries, literary productions. Did you know that lowercase letters were invented by Alcuin? Like the fact that we have lowercase letters today, because they were copying so many books, everything, I mean, if you've ever seen a Roman inscription in a building, it's all capital letters, isn't it, right? Like, you know, whatever, I don't know Latin, you know, something like Caesar conquered this. It's all capital letters. But when you're writing capital letters, that just takes a long time. You've got to take your pen off, you've got to do all this stuff, and they're big, and they've got lots of detail. And so it was in Alcuin's schools that he was like, we've got to be turning over more manuscripts for this educational plan. So they're like, okay, just start writing these kind of simplified letter forms, and you can kind of string them together. Don't even take your pen off the page. So you have cursive lowercase. So look at this. This is Carolingian minuscule, it's called. From where we get, and you can recognize the letter forms as ours today. Do you see this lowercase e, lowercase r? I mean, it's all our lowercase letters. It just blows my mind that that was a time when that didn't exist. Thousands of classical texts, which would otherwise be lost to history, exist to us today from manuscripts written from Alcuin's and Charlemagne's schools. So our earliest examples of Cicero, Horace, and Lucretius, and a bunch of the other Latin rhetors, the oldest actual material parchment manuscripts comes from the Carolingian Renaissance. We wouldn't have a bunch of Cicero if it wasn't for Charlemagne's scribes. Yeah, there's a number of like legal stuff that sort of really increases literacy for the clergy. So there's sort of this multi-armed like legal church thing kind of supporting the Renaissance. I want to say something about Caroline. That's an adjective meaning under the age of Charlemagne. Additions to theology. What we have in Charlemagne, and this is going to make more sense when we come to the very end of this lecture, which we're not going to get to today, but next time, is that the church in the East has this controversy of images, which we're going to explore in some detail. And they say, you know, images can be venerated but not worshipped. They made that distinction. And Charlemagne said, images shouldn't be venerated or worshipped. It's all the same. You're not supposed to do that to an image, right? So they fundamentally reject what's called the Seventh Ecumenical Council of the year 787. So what that does is the single creation of Western art as we know it. Because if an object is to be sort of venerated, it stays within this sort of ecclesiastical sanctioned, it needs to be done the right way. You get the iconic tradition of the East, right? But in the West, if they're just images, they're just art to like instruct us, and we're not going to be kissing the pages or incensing them or venerating them in any way, well then let the artist be creative, right? So at the Council of Frankfurt, when they rejected it, it's the Council of Frankfurt. The reason we have art in the West and that all of our art doesn't just look like this, the Council of Frankfurt. So Western art is authorized. Charlemagne gets crowned emperor. So right now he's just king of the Franks, king of the Lombards. You know, these kings kind of have these titles over the fiefdoms that are theirs. Pope Leo comes to him after some personal assault. Charlemagne accompanies Leo back to Rome. They hold some kind of legal council to figure out what happened. They clear Leo. And on December 25th, they go in for communion on Christmas morning, as Christians still do. And there on the altar is a big crown. And Leo, in the middle of the communion service, at some point in the liturgy, invites Charlemagne up and crowns him and says, you are, what does he say? Emperor of the Romans. You're Emperor of the Romans. And historians to this day are like, they still have no idea what was in Leo's mind. Why did he do that? And did Charlemagne know? And we have differing accounts and all this different stuff. But whatever happens, he becomes Emperor of the Romans. So here's a picture. This is a 13th century manuscript picture. This looks like a pre-Raphaelite sort of thing. No, not pre-Raphaelite, it's kind of classical. Whenever it was. This is Leo III crowning Charlemagne. in St. Peter's Basilica. Kind of a glorious picture, actually. So what's interesting is there's already someone on earth with the title Emperor of the Romans, right? And he's in Constantinople. Like, think back to that map at the very beginning. There's the Eastern Empire with its capital city of Constantinople, and there's a guy there who is the emperor, and he definitely is the emperor. The successor, he is the successor 8 centuries later of the same empirical titles and throne and dignities as Caesar Augustus, and his name is Constantine VI. He co-ruled with his mother Irene, but he ruled badly, and Irene then had him blinded and imprisoned, and Irene becomes the first empress in Roman history. There's no emperor, there's no women emperors until Irene, which sort of throws everyone for a loop, like, can you have a woman emperor? Like, they're just like, and there was a big faction that said no, and there was a faction that was confused, and a faction that said maybe, and, but anyways, it certainly was tumultuous times, and apparently Pope Leo didn't think highly of it, so he's like, look, the East hasn't given us military help for 300 years, they're in total disarray over there, they're saying crazy stuff about images, you know what, new emperor, and he just crowns this new emperor. And what's really interesting is that there's now 2 Roman empires. There's the one centered in Constantinople, which we now differentiate with the term Byzantium. And then there's the newly minted Roman Empire, seated in Aachen, Charlemagne's palace. And we now call this the Holy Roman Empire. It doesn't take that name till the 13th century, but that's how we can distinguish Byzantium, and the Holy Roman Empire. Initially, there were thoughts of unity. Apparently, Charlemagne proposed to Irene, but nothing came of it, and they became political opponents. What's really interesting is here we are, just that next trickle-down step, right? So it begins with Gregory the Great just taking over, making sure the water is coming into the city and kind of acting as mayor. And then you get, trickling down to Zachary crowning Pepin and saying, you're a protector of Rome, thank you, to now the Pope apparently thinks that he has the authority to make an emperor. And Charlemagne agrees and receives it and assumes the title in all his writings hereafter, Emperor of the Roman Empire. So it's very, very interesting to see this sort of synthesis of, this is now where we see sort of the electricity course through, and Rome, the church in the West and the civil authority of the West are now kind of locked in together. So here's a map of Europe around 800. Remember, Charlemagne died 814. So this is the realm we've been talking about, Franconia. He's defending the papal states in here. You still have these other regions as well. Most of Charlemagne's time spent in Aachen. Here's a picture of Aachen. You could go there today. This is Charlemagne's actual throne. Still there. Here's the chapel that he built. Note that it's sort of halfway between what we'd see in... do you remember that picture of the baptistry in Ravenna from like 6th century Byzantine architecture? And yet we're also sort of seeing some new Gothic influence. So, with a well-established kingdom and a Renaissance well underway, there's now the luxury of in-house theological disagreement. And I guess with this we'll end. So, remember last time we saw that what we see in the eastern portion of the church is because they remain stable and stably supported by the empire, they're able to delve into theological minutiae that in wartime you just don't have the luxury to dig into. Same thing kind of happens here in the wake of the Caroline Renaissance. We get the first contributions to a distinct Eucharistic theology. So Eucharist is a name for the meal that Jesus said to do, his disciples to do, and that Christians have always celebrated, and have kind of given some portraits in the last class of how that liturgy evolved. But for the very first time, we get a tract written on no other topic other than the Eucharist, written by this guy named Paschasius Radbertus. And he says that the body and blood, the bread and the wine, really and truly are the literal body and blood of Christ. And this guy comes along, Ratramnus, trying to keep these names straight is impossible because they all sound the same, who says, well, it's more symbolic than that. And there's this big kind of controversy. And then this other monk named Rabanus Maurus, why they all have this R name, I don't know. But he settles it, and they sort of err on the side of it, and they say, no, the teaching of the fathers as we received it is it's more literal than symbolic. Like, between the two of you, Radbertus is right. So this sort of becomes sort of an early Eucharistic controversy. Again, we're going to see sort of echoes of this kind of expanding in the Middle Ages. Because it's one thing to carry this teaching forward, sort of tacitly, in a tradition fashion, like all of the writings of the church fathers of the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Heck, Ignatius of Antioch, who we looked at in the very second lecture of the last class, talked about, the bread that we take is truly the body of Christ. There's this sort of zeal for it, but it's just in the mix of regular Christian life and teaching. Now that it's been sort of taken and isolated and presented as its own thing, like this is our teaching about the Eucharist, it takes on a new solidified shape, which now is liable to become misshapen and out of proportion, as we're going to see with some of the later Eucharistic controversies. So I just want to connect the past to the present. Every emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was crowned by the Pope until Charles V in 1530. This is an amazing swath of history, right? 700 years of continual papal coronations started with Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Empire lasted till Francis II, until the Napoleonic Wars. Right? 1804 was when the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire existed. That's 1,000 years. I feel like, again, because of the sort of the way we divide history in Dark Ages, Renaissance, we kind of forget that actually the cornerstone that was laid by Charlemagne was 1,000-year edifice, right? This was not some Dark Age. Hopefully, Dr. Kicklighter made the same case. Is that one of the things he's always pushing? Or? So I want to connect to this. Does it seem like we're a long way from 12 men in Galilee? It does, right? But the clash, this difficulty between, popes, which the disciples knew nothing of, as we know that word today, crowning emperors for military excursions to expand monks who are also copying classical texts. I mean, the face value of it's like, is this even the same religion, right? But here's what I want to show. This was actually predicted. So if you study the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, one of the tropes which is ubiquitous through all the prophets is non-Jewish nations are almost always referred to by animal symbols. There's these pictures of when Jerusalem is prophesied as being destroyed. It says, the buildings will be destroyed, and the owls and the goats and the rock badgers will dwell in it. And the prophet isn't saying animals are going to inhabit devastated buildings. That's a fairly matter-of-fact statement. It's a prophetic way, an apocalyptic way of saying other nations are going to take over. You're going to hand over your infrastructure to them. You're going to become displaced as a people, and other nations are going to come in. So other animals always have this image of other nations. This is what Jesus says, recorded in Matthew 13. The kingdom of heaven, this is Jesus teaching his mostly peasants and the sick in Galilee. It's like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. I think what Jesus is prophesying, because he, according to the Christian confession, is God and knows the past from the future, is that the kingdom of heaven, which is not a total synonym for the church, but they overlap a lot, the church is like this tiny little thing, just 12 guys who are going to follow me to my death. But it's going to grow and grow and grow, and the birds of the air, if Jesus is speaking in a Jewish context, they knew the Old Testament, they knew he wasn't just making some random poetic picture of birds. He was saying nations are going to nest inside this tree, right? Think about that. Charlemagne coming down to the spiritual head of the Roman Church to be crowned emperor. I think Jesus actually foresaw this. And what I also want to say is this is a picture of Jesus on trial before Pilate, the famous Ecce Homos scene, like behold the man, right, in this trial scene. I think what we have presented in the Gospels of the Bible, in the scene of Jesus before Pilate, is that civil authority and the Christian church are always in this very strange relationship. It's there from the beginning, right? Like, Pilate is at once the man who is 100% accountable and guilty for the crucifixion of Jesus, right? He has the authority to kill Jesus, and he says, crucify, and he says, let it be done, right? So there's a way in which civilization is murderous to Christ, and there's also this ambiguity, like Pilate's also like inquiring of Christ, and he's asking what is truth, and there's that sort of famous scene, right, recorded in the Gospel of John. But I think what we see there in a way is almost like this microcosm of all of church history that would come sort of in the centuries that would follow, of this difficult, tense, problematic relationship between church and state, right? That on the one hand, like, the state could help the church, but is that a friend you want to have, you know? And on the other hand, the state could really hurt the church, and that's what we see, like the warring kings of England, like crushing down Christianity at certain points. And then we see kings trying to help, but then the things that they introduce, like the kingdoms of this world, and this is what Jesus says to Pilate, right? My kingdom is not of this world. It's not sourced out of this world. There's always this ambiguity, and yet all Christians live in this world, in bodies, eating food under political authorities. Like, there's this tension. So the things we're seeing fleshed out in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries are all prophesied and shown forth in a way in the very simple life of the Gospels. And so I don't think, and then like we looked at with Celtic Christianity and also true of Caroline Christianity, even though while so much is different, so much is the same. They're still reading, the books that they're copying are the ones which were first penned by St. Peter, follower of Jesus, St. John, follower of Jesus, St. Paul, latecomer follower to Jesus. They're still reading the same scriptures. They're still celebrating the meal that he said to celebrate the day before this happened. Right? There's this deep continuity, even as it's in a different culture, under totally different legal structures and kingdoms and all this whole thing. So I want to keep that thread connected as we keep marching through, and the medieval church just keeps ballooning. From the next lectures on, we're going to just see this ballooning in every direction. To remember that, there is this continuous thread. Now, I think it does balloon into proportions that are monstrous and need pruning. And that's the Reformation, right? And the Counter-Reformation, in fairness. But it's all connected. It's not a different church. So I don't have time for the eastern portion. That was all the west. So we'll finish the second half of this lecture next time. This is the first time I've put this content together, so I wasn't sure how it would pace out. And so I'm just kind of making stuff, and we'll see how much we can get done. But I won't rush through stuff. We'll give everything its good due. Okay, that's 210. Do we get 210 or 215? 210, okay. So we don't have time for any questions publicly, but if you'd like to meet at the front for a couple minutes, no, not at the front. If you want to meet outside in the hallway, I'll linger for a few minutes if you want to chat about these things. And otherwise, I'll see you next week.